The Man Who Made the World, Part 1. Philip II of Macedon and the Nature of Power. Macedonia, 359 BC. The road north from Thessaly into Macedonia ran through country that the Greeks, even the well-traveled ones, described with a kind of aristocratic distaste. Rough upland valleys, thin soil, timber forests that went on for days. A landscape that produced men who were harder than the men of the south, but whom the men of the south did not, for a very long time, take seriously. The Macedonians spoke a dialect that Athenians found barely intelligible. They drank their wine unmixed, without water, which to a Greek was evidence of something close to barbarism. Their kings hunted on horseback and ate with their soldiers and maintained a court that the polished men of Athens regarded the way a senator regards a county commissioner, with the specific condescension of those who have decided, without quite examining the question, that they are dealing with their inferiors. They were wrong. They would spend 30 years learning how wrong they were. Some of them would not survive the education. In the autumn of 359 BC, a young man of 23 came to power in this country under circumstances that would have destroyed almost anyone else. His name was Philip. His brother, King Perdiccas III, was dead, killed by the Illyrians, along with 4,000 Macedonian soldiers, roughly a third of the kingdom's fighting force, dead in a single afternoon on a field somewhere to the northwest. The Illyrian chieftain Bardalis was not finished. He occupied Macedonian territory and showed no sign of leaving. To the north, the Paeonians were raiding with impunity, burning villages, taking livestock, pushing the border inward. To the east, the Thracian king Cotys had a candidate for the Macedonian throne, a man named Pausanias, and was prepared to enforce the candidacy with arms. To the south, Athens, the great democratic superpower of the Greek world, had its own candidate ready, a pretender named Argaeus, already on Macedonian soil with a force of Athenian soldiers at his back. At least 3 men believed they were about to become king of Macedonia. Armies were moving. The treasury was nearly empty. The noble houses that were supposed to provide the kingdom's cavalry were unreliable, watching the situation, calculating. Philip had no army, no money, and no time. What happened next? What Philip did in the months and years that followed, the specific sequence of decisions he made and the ruthless clarity with which he made them, is a story about power, about how power is built, about the patience required to build it, the deceptions required, the sudden and total violence that is eventually always required, about what the building of it costs the man who builds it, and what it costs the people who get in his way. It is, in short, a story of our time. It is always a story of our time. Part 2. The Theban Education. To understand what Philip became, you must first understand what he saw. In 368 BC, he was 15 years old. Philip was sent to Thebes as a hostage, a diplomatic hostage, a guarantee in human form of his brother's good intentions. He would stay 3 years, living in the household of a general named Pamenus. And through Pamenus, he would enter the orbit of a man named Epaminondas, who was at that moment the most dangerous military thinker in the Greek world, and who was in the process of doing something that the Greeks had believed for 200 years could not be done. He was breaking Sparta. For 2 centuries, the Spartan phalanx had been the supreme military fact of Greek civilization. City-states built their foreign policies around it. Alliances were formed and dissolved in reference to it. When the Spartans marched, men who had spent their entire adult lives preparing to fight them sometimes simply fled. They had earned this fear. Their soldiers trained from childhood. They had not lost a pitched battle against a Greek enemy in living memory. Epaminondas destroyed this in a single afternoon. At Leuctra in 371 BC, 3 years before Philip arrived in Thebes, Epaminondas refused his right wing. held it back, kept it from engaging, and stacked his left wing to a depth that no Greek army had ever attempted. 50 ranks deep where convention demanded 12. He put his best men there, and then he struck obliquely, crashing the weighted left into the Spartan right before the rest of the battle could develop, before the Spartan line could respond, before the famous Spartan discipline could compensate for what was happening. The Spartans lost 400 of their finest soldiers, Spartiates, full Spartan citizens, the irreplaceable core of Spartan military power, in less time than it takes to describe it. Philip was not at Leuctra, but he was in Thebes when the army came home. He was there for the analysis, the discussion, the reconstruction of how it had been done. He was in the household of a man who had fought alongside Epaminondas. He was 15, 16, and 17 years old, in a city electrified by the knowledge that the thing everyone had said was impossible had been possible all along, that the way things had always been done was not the only way, was perhaps not even the best way, was simply the way that had calcified through repetition into assumed necessity. He understood what he was being shown. He had the kind of mind that understood things like this immediately, completely, and permanently. He went home to Macedonia and he built a new army. Not a copy of what Thebes had. Something new. Something that had never existed before. Something that would make the army that had broken Sparta look by comparison like a rehearsal. The sarissa, the weapon, was a pike. This requires a moment to understand properly because the word pike does not carry the weight it should. The sarissa, the pike Philip put in the hands of his Macedonian infantry, was between 15 and 21 feet long. To hold one level required 2 hands. To maneuver it required training measured not in weeks but in years. It was, by any ordinary measure of individual combat, an absurd weapon. A Homeric hero, the kind of warrior the Greeks had been celebrating in poetry for 4 centuries, the man who steps forward from the line to accept a challenge, who fights man to man, blade to blade, whose individual excellence determines the battle, could do nothing useful with a sarissa. The sarissa was not built for individual excellence. It was built for something else entirely. In formation, in the close, disciplined, precisely dressed formation that Philip drilled into his men until it was not a technique but a reflex, the sarissa phalanx presented to any enemy that approached it not a single rank of spear points, but 5. The pikes of the second rank extended past the shoulders of the first, the pikes of the third extended past the second, the fourth past the third, the fifth past the fourth. What moved toward an enemy line was not a line of men, but a moving thicket of iron, overlapping, interlocking, presenting no gap, no angle, no opening through which a man could pass without first somehow getting through 16 feet of pike shaft. It was nearly impossible to close with. And what cannot be closed with cannot be fought. But Philip understood, and this is the mark of the man, the specific quality of his intelligence, that a weapon which cannot be closed with is also a weapon that cannot maneuver. The phalanx was lethal in a straight push on flat ground, on broken terrain, or against enemies who refused to engage it frontally, or when struck from the flank or rear, it was vulnerable in ways that a simpler formation was not. The sarissa was a system, not a solution. It required completion. The completion was the cavalry. Philip built the heteroi, the companion cavalry, from the Macedonian nobility, men who had grown up on horseback, and trained them to charge in a wedge formation at a single concentrated point. The logic was brutal and simple. The phalanx fixed the enemy in place, pinned them, held them, denied them movement. The cavalry found the moment when the enemy was fully committed, fully engaged, unable to shift or respond, and struck through them like a blade through cloth. 2 weapons. 1 system. Neither sufficient alone. Together something the ancient world had not seen before and would not see surpassed for more than a century. Philip designed it. Philip built it. Philip drilled it until it worked. He marched with his men, ate with them, slept in the field alongside them. He banned the use of pack animals early in his campaigns. His soldiers would carry their own equipment because men who carried their own equipment developed the conditioning that long campaigns required, and Philip was already thinking about long campaigns. He was always thinking further ahead than the men around him thought to look. Part 3. How power is actually built. There is a version of Philip's story, the simplified version, the version that flatters the idea of military genius as the primary currency of history, in which he simply built the army and then conquered with it. This version is wrong, and it is wrong in ways that matter. Philip used his army as the last resort. Before the army came everything else. In the first months of his reign, surrounded by enemies on 4 sides, he did not fight. He paid, he bribed the Paeonians, bought them off with money and promises and the implicit message that a living Macedonia was more useful to them as a neighbor than a destroyed one. He negotiated with Athens, surrendering a disputed coastal city called Amphipolis, giving Athens what Athens wanted before Athens could make him give it by force. He entered into rapid diplomatic marriages, Phila of Elymiotis to secure the Macedonian highlands, Odata of Illyria to neutralize the western threat, Philina of Larissa for Thessalian connections. He was not finished. He would marry 4 more times. Each marriage was a calculation. Each was also a form of intelligence gathering. A wife from a neighboring kingdom came with knowledge of that kingdom, its strengths, its tensions, its internal politics, its men who could be bought and its men who could not. Philip did not make the mistake of thinking that war and politics were separate activities. They were the same activity, conducted by different means, and the goal was always the same. Power secured, extended, made permanent. Only after the board was cleared, the Paeonians neutralized, Athens temporarily satisfied, the pretenders dealt with, did he turn on the Illyrians. He destroyed them in open battle. The king Bardalis, who was by now well past 70 years old, and who had spent his life fighting and winning, was killed. The territory Bardalis had taken was recovered. The western border was restored, and then pushed further out. He was 23 years old, and then he started on Greece. Part 4. What Demosthenes knew. In Athens, in the law courts and the assembly and the colonnaded walks where the city's political life conducted itself in perpetual, garrulous, magnificent argument, there was one man who understood what was happening in the north and spent the rest of his life trying to make his countrymen understand it too. His name was Demosthenes. He was a lawyer and a politician, and perhaps the greatest orator in a city that had produced the greatest orators of the ancient world. The speeches he gave against Philip, the Philippics, as they came to be called, a word that entered the language permanently as a synonym for impassioned political denunciation, are masterworks of alarm. They are urgent and lucid, and reading them across 23 centuries, shot through with a frustration that is almost unbearable, the frustration of the man who sees clearly being forced to watch the men around him refuse to see at all. Philip was bribing them. This was the core of what Demosthenes understood and what his audiences kept refusing to credit. Philip was funding the pro-Macedonian factions in every major city-state, finding the men who could be bought, which in any city is not a small number of men, and buying them. He had studied the Greek city-states long enough to know where their internal fault lines ran, and he was pressing on those fault lines with money and patience and the specific kind of sophistication that comes from a man who has had to be sophisticated his entire life because he could not afford to be otherwise. Philip himself was known to have said, "The exact words vary in the sources, but the substance is consistent, that there was no wall so high that a donkey carrying gold could not enter it." He said this without embarrassment. He meant it as operational principle, not metaphor. The Athenians mostly did not believe Demosthenes, and part of the reason they did not believe him was that Philip in person was not what they expected. Men who had negotiated with him came back charmed. He was physically imposing, large, scarred, missing an eye he had lost at the siege of Macedon, the kind of body that recorded its history in damage, but in conversation he was warm, witty, genuinely curious, generous with his attention in the way that powerful men who are also intelligent sometimes are. He loved wine and symposia and philosophical argument. He had brought Aristotle to his court to tutor his son. He did not behave like a tyrant. He behaved like a king who happened to be better at being a king than anyone else alive. This was, in a way, the most dangerous thing about him. Part 5. Cheronia. It ended, as these things end, on a battlefield. In the summer of 33-8 BC, Philip brought his army south through the pass at Thermopylae. He had managed through years of patient maneuvering to secure the political position that gave him that route, and into Boeotia. The Athenians and Thebans, finally united after years of failing to unite, moved to meet him near a town called Cheronea. The Theban contingent included the sacred band, 300 men, organized by deliberate design in pairs, each soldier paired with the man he loved. The theory, and it had proven correct in battle after battle for nearly 4 decades, was that a man will not run while the man he loves is watching, and will not leave while the man he loves is in danger. They had never broken. In the long memory of Greek warfare, they had never once broken. Philip placed his 18-year-old son Alexander in command of the Macedonian left wing, positioned directly opposite the sacred band. The sources differ on the precise mechanics of what followed, but the result is not in dispute. Philip's right wing, which he commanded personally, executed a withdrawal, a disciplined, controlled retreat that was not a retreat at all, but a maneuver, pulling the Athenian soldiers opposite him out of their formation, drawing them forward, lengthening the line, creating a gap. It required iron discipline from his men, who had to move backward without breaking, and it required that the Athenians take the bait, which they did, which they almost had to do, because a retreating enemy is an irresistible invitation, and because the Athenians had been told for years that Macedonian soldiers were not real soldiers. When the gap opened, Alexander moved. The sacred band was surrounded, cut off from the Theban line, isolated, encircled. The sources record that Philip's officers or Philip himself offered them terms: surrender, lay down the sarissas, live. They refused. All 300 of them refused. They stood in the position they had been trained since boyhood to hold, and they died there. Every one of them, on a dusty field in Boeotia in the summer heat. Philip walked the battlefield afterward. He came to where the sacred band lay. He stood among them for a long time. Ancient sources record that he wept, or something close to it, some sudden, visible emotion that he allowed himself briefly before putting it away. These were men who had chosen something absolute. They had chosen not to survive the defeat of the thing they loved. Philip, who had spent his entire adult life making every compromise necessary to survive and to win, stood among these 300 men who had made the opposite choice, and felt something. We do not know exactly what he felt. We know he stood there. Then he walked on. There was still Greece to organize. There was still Persia to plan for. There was still everything left to do.
Part 6. The Design.
By 337 BC, Philip had organized the Greek city-states into the League of Corinth. He had done it with the meticulous care of a man who understood that a conquest that humiliated its subjects was a conquest that required perpetual military enforcement, which was too expensive, and so he had left the Greeks their assemblies and their laws and their local governance while removing from them the only thing that actually mattered: the power to make war and peace independently. They were free in every way that did not count. He was shrewd enough to let them believe it was almost enough. Then he declared a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia. The framing was carefully chosen. This was vengeance for Xerxes. This was the Greeks united at last, taking back what had been taken from them a century and a half before. Philip understood that the Greeks needed a story they could tell themselves about what was happening to them, and he gave them one. It was not entirely false, it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Philip intended to break the Persian Empire, the greatest state in the known world, and that he had been building toward this for 20 years, and that the League of Corinth was the last piece he needed, and that Greece was not the destination but the base of operations. In 336 BC, he sent an advance force of 10,000 men across the Hellespont under Parmenion. They established a bridgehead. They were waiting for Philip and the main army. The road into Asia was open. He never took it. Part 7. Aegae Summer 336 BC. The celebration was for his daughter's wedding. It was held in Aegae, the old Macedonian capital, a city with a long history and a theater where the celebration was to be staged with a kind of Hellenic grandeur appropriate to the king of Macedon and hegemon of all the Greeks. Philip processed into the theater. He had, for the occasion, sent his bodyguards ahead at a distance, a gesture of confidence, a demonstration that the king of Macedon walked among his people unafraid. A man named Pausanias was waiting for him. Pausanias was one of Philip's own bodyguards. What drove him to it? The sources offer a personal grievance, a humiliation inadequately addressed, or the possibility of larger conspiracies that ancient historians gesture at without fully tracing edge. It remains genuinely unclear. What he did is not unclear. He drove a knife into Philip and ran. He nearly made it to horses that were waiting for him. He did not quite make it. Philip II of Macedon was 46 years old. He had ruled for 23 years. He had taken a kingdom facing extinction and built it into the dominant power of the ancient world. He had invented a military system of such sophistication that it would not be materially improved upon for generations. He had broken Thebes, subdued Athens, organized Greece, and designed the invasion of the greatest empire on earth. He left all of it to a 20-year-old son who would cross the Hellespont 2 years later and spend the next 13 years not stopping. Part 8. What he built. Alexander conquered Persia. He conquered Egypt. He pushed through Central Asia, crossed the Hindu Kush, stood on the edge of India. No one in the ancient world had done what he did or gone where he went. And the world has never quite recovered from the habit of saying his name first. But the army that held at Gaugamela, that drove through the Persian center while the flanks bent and nearly broke, was Philip's army. The treasury that funded the campaign was built on Philip's conquests. The political structure that kept the Greek rear stable while the expedition went east was Philip's League of Corinth. The strategic concept that Persia could be broken, that it was worth trying, that a Macedonian army could sustain operations at that distance, was Philip's concept, developed over 20 years, tested incrementally, proven by the time Alexander inherited it. Alexander executed. Philip designed. There is a passage. The sources handle it with varying levels of conviction, but its emotional weight persists in the telling, in which Alexander, in the last years of his life, in the weariness and grief and rage and drinking that marked the end of everything, said to the men around him that Philip had found them wandering and poor and clothed in skins, herding a few livestock on the hills, and had made them lords of the world. Whether he said it in exactly those words, he knew it was true. He had always known it was true. It was perhaps one of the things that drove him, the knowledge that the man he could not surpass was already dead, that the race he was running was against someone who would never run again, that the greatest thing he could ever do was complete another man's vision. Power does this. Power, built by one man and handed to another, creates this specific and inescapable burden. The son who must be greater than the father, the heir who must justify the inheritance, the man who must become more than the man he was given everything to become. Philip understood this too, in his way. He watched Alexander closely. He knew what he had. He stood in the theater at Aga, and the knife found him, and whatever he understood after that, he understood alone. The body was carried back into the palace at Age. The old king's wives and the officers and the servants were still there. Within days, Alexander had secured the loyalty of the army and begun moving against the claimants who would inevitably rise. He was fast, and he was decisive, and he was ruthless. He had learned this from someone.